let's look at the warm-up. So the warm-up was actually it's kind of amazing. Um, Normally there's kind of a range, but everybody kind of totally kicked butt on this warm-up. So that's a good sign. So for whatever reason, this part of the brain was something everybody like kind of connected with here. So we can go through this review really quick because most people seem to really got it. Someone is awake but relaxed, EEG or alpha waves. Again, we talked about beta waves if you're kind of more alert and concentrating. The theta and the delta are the slower waves, more when you're asleep. Gamma, I didn't really talk about, but I should mention. Those are much higher frequencies. And they're actually interesting too. They're studied a lot. They often come up in discussions around consciousness because they seem to be arising more from kind of coordinated and synchronous activity in different parts of the brain. Like I've mentioned earlier, that seems to be implicated in some of what we call like the binding problem, like making all these disparate parts of your mental processes all somehow be part of the same experience. Blue waves, there's no such thing as blue waves. I just put that in there like if you're in the ocean or something. Critical for consolidation of memory was hippocampus. Everyone got that as well. Again, hippocampus also a critical part of limbic system. So, the emotional value of an experience or memory can affect how strongly it is transferred into long-term memory. During REM, the EEG. So this one most people got. EEG is high. Again, they call it paradoxical sleep because it doesn't seem like you're asleep at all. Your EEG is high frequency. Your heart rate is higher. Your temperature is going up. So as opposed to the slow wave sleep where your brain waves are really slow and your temperature and heart rate are going down. Name 3 brain regions considered part of the limbic system. Here, people also kind of nailed this. Again, we talked about the amygdala, the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, the insula. There's parts of the thalamus. There's a cingulate gyrus. There's a variety of regions. And dreaming, again, mainly in REM. There is evidence that dreams can occur in different phases of sleep, but most of the time, when people are dreaming, it's during REM. So with that, we are done with the CNS. We spent a lot of time looking at the brain, looking at it both physically, looking at it kind of more region by region, as well as these more kind of integrative aspects of what's going on. What we're going to do now is move to the peripheral nervous system. So we'll spend some time looking at the motor, which we'll be able to finish up in the next probably hour or something, and then we'll dig into the sensory. The sensory is going to take us a little longer to get through, but we'll cover the stuff we've been looking at in lab, but in more depth. And then once we're done with that, we'll do the muscles, and that will be kind of the demarcation line for what you'll be responsible for on exam 2, which will be coming up like not the Tuesday after break, but a week from that Tuesday. So let's do this. All right. PNS, peripheral nervous system. And again, we talked about it being motor versus sensory. In the sensory, we're going to put off to on the shelf, and we'll look at that later. Right now, we're going to focus on the motor. What are the two main divisions of the motor division? There's two main subdivisions here. Somebody?
Is it somatic?
Yeah, so one was somatic,
Autonomic.
autonomic. Remember, this was from when we entered the very first day we ever got to the nervous system, saying it's important to remember this kind of roadmap of the whole system. So we've been focusing on the CNS. Remember, we said CNS and PNS were these two main divisions. And now we're looking at the PNS, and the PNS is then subdivided into sensory and motor. We're focusing on the motor, and now we're going to be looking at somatic versus autonomic. So again, as we look at each of these different parts, it's important to keep track of how it fits into the bigger picture of the arrangement of the nervous system. So what we're going to do now is focus on the somatic. Although autonomic, what are the subdivisions of autonomic?
Sympathetic and parasympathetic.
Mm-hmm. Sympathetic and parasympathetic. All right, but again, we're going to put autonomic on the shelf. We're just going to focus on somatic right now. And what is the defining quality of the somatic motor division?
Under voluntary control.
Yeah, it's controlling the stuff that's voluntary, in particular your skeletal muscles. So this is the signals coming from your precentral gyrus going down those pyramidal tracts of ultimately connecting up to your muscles and activating your muscles and making your biceps or your triceps or whatever other skeletal muscle move your body around. So that's what we're going to look at right now. And this one is pretty easy. We're going to be able to kind of do the somatic motor in a nutshell in like 3 minutes here, maybe 5 minutes. So we're going to start with the CNS, because that's where the signals are coming that are ultimately controlling your muscles, right? And then here's some muscle. So this is a muscle cell, skeletal muscle cell. Yeah, I'm making it, remember, if you've been in anatomy, even I think regular biology, striated skeletal muscle, it's actually kind of stripy looking. Next class will look more detailed why it looks stripy. It's that alternating actin and myosin. But so skeletal muscle cell, this is just the cell that makes up all of those muscles that your deltoids, your trapezoids, your abdominals, whatever. This is just your classic skeletal muscle. And somatic motor are going to be the things that go and connect up to it. And in the somatic motor, there's always one neuron that goes all the way from the CNS. It has its cell body in the CNS. The soma. And then the neuron has an axon that goes all the way to the target muscle.
Professor.
Uh-huh.
So, like, when somebody has, say, like problems with their sciatic nerve, is that technically like the axon?
Yeah, exactly. A nerve is a bundle of axons. So like if you're somatic, and if there's compression or some damage to your sciatic nerve, the nerves are both ways. It's the sensory and motor. So it could affect your kind of motor control going down the back of your leg, or it could be perceived as pain or something, because those are also the signals that are taking the sensory messages back up into your central nervous system. So, but yeah, sciatic nerve is a classic one to get compressed, either due to, there's a variety of things. It goes through little restrictors between muscles, and it's easy to have it get compromised in there. And again, it could create weakness in the muscles that it's supposed to activate, or it could be perceived as sensation that really isn't there, because it's also the sensory axons. So right now we're going to focus just on the motor. So, but yeah, these axons that we're talking about here, most of them are traveling bundled in these nerves, like the sciatic nerve or the femoral nerve or the ulnar nerve or the median nerve or this or that nerve. So that's those are the axons. This is just the axon. And again, these axons can be really long. Remember I talked about in the very beginning when we introduced neurons. This one cell, if this is like in my foot, this muscle, say I'm wiggling my toes, that means this cell has to reach all the way from my spinal cord, which is kind of in the middle of my back, all the way down my leg to my tip of my toe, right? So this is a really big cell, really long cell, I should say. Yeah, that's why we often call nerve cells like nerve fibers, because they're really long and skinny, like a fiber. So somatic motor, one defining quality, there's only one neuron from the CNS to the target muscle cell. We'll see when we get into the autonomic that there are going to be two neurons. It's going to be kind of a relay. One neuron leaves the CNS and synapses in a ganglion, and then from the ganglion, then you continue on to the target muscle, which is usually smooth muscle or maybe a gland or something. So one neuron. The other thing that's a defining quality of somatic motor is the synapse, where you actually activate the muscle. So this, we call this the neuromuscular junction. Right? It's the junction between the nerve or the neuron and the muscle. So the neuromuscular junction, and it's basically a synapse. And again, we're going to look at it in more detail when we look at the muscles in more detail, but it's basically a synapse. It's like a chemical synapse. Synapse. Let me. And the axon always releases acetylcholine. Which we'll see is not the case in the autonomic. In autonomic, some of them release acetylcholine, some of them release like norepinephrine or something. The receptors, so again, we're at the synapse here, we're releasing acetylcholine from this motor neuron, somatic motor neuron. Maybe I should just write, this is my somatic motor neuron. Somatic motor neuron is always releasing acetylcholine at the target. And the muscle cell obviously has to have receptors that bind acetylcholine. And those receptors are always nicotinic cholinergic receptors. So nicotinic cholinergic receptors, which we have introduced before. What are the kind of defining characteristics of nicotinic cholinergic receptors that we mentioned?
Don't they bind nicotine?
I mean, that is how we identify them, kind of distinguish them, but that's not so much like the main kind of functional thing that we want to look at right now.
Is directly gated
Yeah,
sodium
exactly.
channel.
These are directly gated cation channels. So they're going to be always excitatory, right? So this neuromuscular junction, this is always excitatory. Because we're releasing acetylcholine to this nicotinic receptors. Nicotinic receptors always open cation channels, which are going to depolarize the muscle cell and going to excite it. This is going to be different than when we get to the autonomic, where we're going to have second messenger systems, and we don't know what the response is going to be at the target. It might actually inhibit or excite the target. So somatic. So if you send a message down a somatic motor neuron, you know that the target muscle is gonna twitch and contract, which again is not the case when we get to the autonomic. So this is kind of in a nutshell the somatic motor. Nutshell. Any questions about that? Clear. Okay, cool. So what we're going to do now is shift gears, and this has all been somatic motor. Check. Now we are going to look at, we're going to take the autonomic off the shelf, and we're going to take a look at the autonomic in more detail. This one's going to take a little bit more time because there's more going on here. Partly because the connection to the muscles or the targets are more complicated. Like I said, it's going to take a couple of steps instead of just one. Partly because there's two different subdivisions, and each of those have their own distinct properties, both anatomical and kind of physiological. So we're going to look at autonomic motor now. Again, in general, what are the targets? What is the target of an autonomic motor neuron? What is it activating?
Gland.
Could be a gland. What else?
Smooth muscles?
Yes, smooth muscle, like the involuntary muscle, the muscle that's changing the diameter of your blood vessels or making your stomach smush around, or changing the diameter of your pupil with your your lens to do the focusing, right? You don't think about, I better relax or squish my lens to make things focus. It automatically happens. You focus kind of without even thinking about it. Your blood pressure stays stable by having the blood vessels constrict or relax to adjust diameters and stuff, but that's all happening automatically. You don't think about, oh, I better constrict some of my major arteries to keep my blood pressure high enough so I don't black out right now. It's like, no, it's just automatic happening. You don't think about it. So these are autonomic motor neurons are going to be Activating smooth muscle is going to be activating glands. So again, we're going to put the CNS here, because obviously it is originating from the CNS. There's a few differences we're going to talk about between autonomic and somatic. So like I've been mentioning, it's going to take two neurons to get to the target. Let's say the target is the heart. Right, and what would sympathetic stimulation of the heart do?
Increase heart rate?
Would increase the heart rate. It'd be speeding up the heart. And parasympathetic activation would
Slow it down.
slow it down. In both cases, there's going to be an initial neuron who is located in the CNS. But then synapses with a second neuron that then continues to the target. And again, we mentioned cell bodies that are located outside of the CNS are called what? What do we call neuron cell bodies that are outside of the CNS?
Ganglion.
Exactly. So this is a ganglion. So we have a ganglion. We have our postganglionic neuron here. We have our preganglionic neuron here. This is the first one that so the synapse in the ganglion is just kind of like a relay. This is just acetylcholine to nicotinic cholinergic receptors. So we don't have to think too much about the ganglion. Basically, when the message is leaving the CNS, it just basically gets continued and sent on towards the target from the ganglion. So this is this is similar, whether you're looking at sympathetic or autonomic, it's always going to be two neurons from CNS to target. And the target might be smooth muscle, target might be a gland, as opposed to the skeletal muscle for the somatic. What we're going to do now is look at the differences between sympathetic and parasympathetic. And there are some major differences. So here's my CNS again. All right, so I'll do the two sides this time. This side's going to be sympathetic. This side will be parasympathetic. And again, remember, sympathetic in general is that kind of fight or flight. It's the one that's speeding up your heart, dilating your bronchial passages, dilating your pupils. Parasympathetic is that rest and digest, kind of slowing down your heart, increasing digestive processes and diverting blood to your, kind of digestion, where sympathetic is sending blood to your skeletal muscles to run away from that tiger. So where the neurons start for the sympathetic or parasympathetic is different. So parasympathetic, the first neuron comes out of either the cranial nerves, and if you've been in anatomy, those are 12 cranial nerves, including the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve, remember, cranial nerve 10, which is the one that actually leaves the head, vagabond, wandering nerve. And then sacral nerves, the nerves coming out from the sacral. So sympathetic, in fact, let me get my little typing tool because this will be prettier. We talk about the parasympathetic originating from a cranial sacral outflow. Meaning cranial nerves and sacral nerves are the nerves that begin the parasympathetic. I'll say like maybe 70% from the vagus nerve. Just remember, it's cranial nerve 10. So vagus nerve is just like a major nerve leaving from your brainstem, goes down through your foramen magnum and just starts going all over your body. We'll talk more about the vagus nerve, but this is going to be important. Like when we talk about spinal cord injuries, right? You can have a spinal cord injury and that is not going to have as big an impact on parasympathetic, because 70% of the parasympathetic innervation is actually coming from the brain. It's not even, doesn't care about the spinal cord. So it's actually clinically relevant that, a majority of your parasympathetic innervation starts from the cranial nerve rather than having to go down the spinal cord. Sympathetic, on the other hand, sympathetic is originating from both the thoracic region and the lumbar region. So this is what we're going to call the thoracolumbar outflow. Oh, I want to be in the right color. Right, so this actually does have implications again for like spinal cord injury. If you have a spinal cord injury above the thoracic region, which would be like kind of quadriplegic, that's going to have major implications for sympathetic messages getting out of, where they need to go. If you have spinal cord damage somewhere along the way, thoracic or lumbar region, you'll actually have differential issues. Like I've read about, because the sympathetic actually activates your sweat glands. So you can have people that will sweat up to a certain level on their body and not below, because that's where the damage is, and below that, the sympathetic messages are no longer being transmitted, right? So again, it just for spinal cord injury, it's worth remembering how the sympathetic and the parasympathetic originate. Other things that are different. Parasympathetic has one really long preganglionic neuron that goes almost all the way to the target, and then a really short postganglionic. So if I'm gonna write this out using my little typer again, I want it in the right color. Long preganglionic, short postganglionic. And in fact, ganglia near the target. So we often talk about intramural or terminal ganglia, because the ganglia, again, the cell body of the second neuron, is usually right near where the target is, or even within the walls of the target organ. Sympathetic, on the other hand, has the ganglia right near the spine. And then a long second neuron to get to the target. And again, I'll write that out. So short preganglionic, long postganglionic, ganglions. Yeah, the lions that have gone bad and are going out like shaking down the zebras for grass or something. So, again, if you've been in anatomy, we talk about the sympathetic chain of ganglia. You have all of these ganglia along the right near the spine. They're kind of right along, kind of glued onto the vertebrae. And again, we're not going to go into the details of that right now. Sympathetic fibers have the option to actually jack into the spinal nerves and travel to their destination along spinal nerves because of this layout. And again, in anatomy, you go way into detail about how sympathetic fibers, the white and gray rami communicons and all of that, where you can actually hook up the postganglionic axon into the spinal nerve to get it to its destination. But for our class, don't worry about that. So this is just anatomically. Then the last thing we really need to focus here is this postganglionic neuron. If we're in the parasympathetic, I want to be in blue. Ganglia. So the postganglionic neuron releases acetylcholine at its target, which was similar to not similar, it's exactly what we saw in the somatic, but the big difference here is the target has muscarinic cholinergic receptors. Macaroni! Come on, silly. So what does that mean about what's going to happen to the target when we release acetylcholine at it? What do we know about muscarinic cholinergic receptors?
They're second messenger indirect, and we don't know what the result will be. Depends on the situation.
Yeah, exactly. Everybody here, Raina, these are the ones that use second messenger pathways. So what happens at the target, it's going to depend on the situation at that particular target, right? Sometimes parasympathetic will inhibit, like it slows down your heart, but it actually stimulates your digestive system, right? So what happens when you activate a parasympathetic motor neuron and release acetylcholine at the target? It's going to depend. It might slow it down, it might speed it up. So again, that's why it's important to know that it's muscarinic, which have that flexibility. Remember, that was one of the advantages of second messenger signaling, is this flexibility that you have in what the response is. In the somatic motor neurons with the nicotinic receptors, there's no flexibility. It's like you activate a somatic motor neuron, you contract the muscle. That's just it. There's no other options. So parasympathetic, there's a huge variety of options. All right, so that's parasympathetic. Let's go to sympathetic. In this case, neuron releases. So I should say usually releases. Let me typically, because there's going to be some exceptions. Typically releases either let me write it out since you haven't seen this before, norepinephrine, which goes by the name NE, or epinephrine, which goes by the name epi. You know, targets have, alpha and beta adrenergic receptors. So postganglionic neuron releases epinephrine or norepinephrine. Typically, norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter. It's released by a synaptic bouton and binding receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. Epinephrine tends to be released as a hormone. So we should mention hormones a little more. Everything in the nervous system that we've been talking about is more of this kind of direct connection. There is some neuron here that, let me make it a different color. Some neuron here, there's some message coming down. There's a synapse. We release neurotransmitter. This one binds the neurotransmitter. We continue the message to the target. So this is this very kind of focused kind of thing. It's like if this synapse is going off, the neighboring synapse is not triggered, right? It is only triggered if its neuron that's feeding that synapse is being activated. So there's this more kind of focused kind of activation. I can send a message down to this thing, but it's not going to go everywhere. With hormones, you basically dump the signaling molecule into the bloodstream. So in the case of the sympathetic thing, one of the things you can do, instead of going and synapsing in the synaptic chain, you can go to what's called the adrenal gland. Maybe I may just draw on a new thing. Right, so if we're looking at the, most of what we've been saying, oh, we have our first neuron here, there's some sympathetic ganglion here, and then we continue on. But another option, let's say this is your kidneys. The adrenal gland, we're going to talk more about the adrenal gland when we get to the endocrine system later, but it's basically a little gland that's located, people in these books, they often say, perched like a little cap atop the kidney. So it's a gland that happens, it's not part of the kidney, it just happens to be co-localized. It happens to be sitting on top of the kidney. And it has different parts we'll talk about. There's the adrenal cortex, which makes more steroid hormones, but the middle of it is called the adrenal medulla. That's the center part of the adrenal gland. This makes epinephrine. And again, epinephrine is also known as adrenaline. Adrenaline and epinephrine are the same thing. And basically, just goes into the bloodstream. So what that means is, if we go back to this other picture here, where I was saying if you are on an autonomic motor neuron synapsing in the ganglion, continuing on to your target, this is going to be kind of a focused kind of response. If I instead trigger a dump of adrenaline from the adrenal gland into the bloodstream, it's going everywhere. And everything that has the adrenergic receptor is going to respond. And a lot of these adrenergic receptors, they don't care whether it's adrenaline or norepinephrine. They'll respond to either one. But this means that you're going to have this global response, right? If you go just along a neural pathway, like an axon to a ganglion to another axon, I can have my eyes dilating, but not my heart changing speed. Or I could have my bronchial passages dilating, but not my eyes dilating. If I dump adrenaline into the bloodstream, it's just everywhere. Everything that has a receptor is going to get activated. My eyes will dilate. My heart's going to speed up. The blood's going to get shunted to my muscles. My bronchial passage will dilate to pull air down. Right? It's all those, it's basically that fight or flight just all at once. And another difference about doing a hormone release like this is you can't turn it off quite as fast, right? We can stop, okay, wait, no, there's no actual danger here, but actually we still have all this adrenaline or epinephrine floating around in the bloodstream. It takes a few minutes for it to totally clear out and to kind of get back to your baseline, right? So like if you, it's like, oh my God, there's some big monster coming in. Your like heart's going like bump, 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 bump. And then you realize, oh, that's just my friend in a monster suit that was just scaring me. There's no danger here at all. It's going to take a little while before you don't just instantly go back to like, oh, it's all good. You're like, it takes a while for that adrenaline dump to clear out and kind of re-equilibrate. So sympathetic, when we think about sympathetic, it's different from parasympathetic in that it's got, short first, long second. It's different in that it has norepinephrine and epinephrine rather than primarily acetylcholine. However, and another difference is it has this ability to do this global activation through the release of epinephrine, adrenaline into your system. That's something parasympathetic. There's no like global, turn on everything and just relax. You got to work at it a little more. The reason why I'm saying it typically releases norepinephrine, there are a few exceptions where it actually does use acetylcholine. Specifically like in the, it activates sweat glands, and the synapse to activate a sweat gland is actually acetylcholine. But for the most part, you can just assume sympathetic is epinephrine and norepinephrine. Parasympathetic is going to be acetylcholine. There are so many drugs that are part of the pharmacopoeia that are either cholinergic agonists and antagonists or adrenergic agonists and antagonists in order to modulate your autonomic nervous system. If you're trying to suppress digestive things and don't want to salivate as much, or you might give them an antagonist to the acetylcholine so they don't have that digestive stimulation. If you're trying to slow down their heart, you might give them an adrenergic antagonist that is going to block that excitatory activity on the heart. If you're trying to dilate your bronchial passages because you're having an asthma attack, you might give an adrenergic agonist, turn on that sympathetic activation and widen your bronchial passages. So there's all sorts of different, or if you're trying to, you can also do some local stuff. Like if you're at the doctor's office for an eye exam, and here's your eye. You're kind of looking up and the doc is shining a little pen light in your eye to kind of see what's going on. Normally, if you shine a light in somebody's eye, what's going to happen?
Your pupil gets smaller.
Yeah, the pupil is going to constrict, and then they're not going to be able to look inside and see what's going on inside your eyeball. So how could you block that pupil constriction if you want to actually be able to shine a light through the pupil and kind of look around inside the eye?
You got to somehow stop that parasympathetic response.
Exactly. And what would we use? What kind of eye drops would we add in here to block the parasympathetic response?
Some sort of dilating eye drops?
No. So I want you to think about what division is constricting. We want to stop the constriction. So we want to just block that. What division is causing pupillary constriction, and how would we stop that from happening? So for what division is causing pupillary constriction?
The parasympathetic?
It's parasympathetic. And what neurotransmitter is mediating parasympathetic activity?
Acetylcholine?
Acetylcholine, exactly. So what kind of drug do we want to add in these eye drops to block the pupils from constricting in response to light?
Nicotinic antagonist?
Exactly. right? Hopefully this kind of makes sense. This kind of ties this together. If you give somebody some eye drops that block acetylcholine receptors, then you shine a light in their eye, there's going to be some response from your autonomic nervous system activating the smooth muscle in your iris to actually the circular muscle to constrict, kind of shut your pupil down. But if you have an antagonist on board here, then that message isn't going to get to the receptor, so the eye is going to stay open, stay more dilated. Right? Does that make sense? Right? The same way if I have there are drugs that they'll actually give people for like performance anxiety. It's like they have to go on stage and read something and they just go boom, their heart's beating out of their chest and they're so freaked out that they are having trouble even like holding it together. What kind of drug would you give this person before they go walked out on stage so they don't have this like kind of experience of their hearts just starting to beat super fast and sweating and having all this sympathetic fear, fight or flight activation?
Beta blocker?
Exactly. You give them a beta adrenergic antagonist, which you call a beta blocker is its kind of common name. But it's beta blocker because it's blocking the beta adrenergic receptors. And so that means they walk out in front of the crowd, they're sympathetic, their brain says, holy crap. And it sends a message to their adrenal gland, which sends epinephrine everywhere, except the epinephrine can't get to the receptor. So your heart doesn't speed up, and you don't feel like you're kind of freaking out, and people do much better. So these beta blockers are also used for high blood pressure because they keep the heart slower, they keep the contractility of lower the contractile strength of the heart muscle. We'll talk about that in much more detail when we get to the cardiovascular system, why beta blockers are good as hypertensive medicines, or hypertension medicines, I should say. But just I really want you to get the sense that there are a whole lot of drugs that are out there that can preferentially either activate or inhibit sympathetic or parasympathetic, and that's a really useful thing to be able to do. And it's only possible because there's this very distinct difference between those two divisions. What else should I say here?
Dr. E.
Uh-huh.
So what is like the indicator that we should know it blocks, that we would want to block the beta adrenergic receptors instead of the alpha?
So in fact, don't worry about the different subtypes of adrenergic receptors. So there are different adrenergic receptors. They get localized different places. Some of them are more common on the heart or the lungs or this, which is actually useful. That's something when you get into pharmacology later on, you will have to know where are the different subtypes of receptors and which of these particular drugs is going to be useful for what you're looking for. But for our class, I just want you to have this sense of, adrenergic agonist. The reason why I put the beta adrenergic agonist here is because in just the common tongue, we always say beta blockers. And beta blocker wouldn't make any sense unless you realize that the beta is actually beta adrenergic. And even there's beta 1 and beta 2. I should mention there's one counterintuitive kind of adrenergic agonist that does the opposite of what you think. Let's do this really briefly. Alpha 2 is presynaptic. and actually inhibits norepinephrine release. So let me talk about this really briefly because it's just kind of fun. So let's say here's your synapse. Let's say that it uses adrenaline or norepinephrine. And so here's our adrenergic receptors. Here we're releasing, let's say this is norepinephrine. But these alpha 2 receptors, maybe I'll make them yellow, are actually on the thing that's releasing the norepinephrine. So they come back and they bind these receptors, and that's a signal to that neuron that there's already enough norepinephrine. You can stop releasing it, right? So if you give somebody an alpha 2 agonist, it's actually a little counterintuitive. You're not actually turning on the sympathetic response, you're turning it off because you're actually activating this special subtype of receptors that's telling the neurons there's already enough adrenaline around, or norepinephrine, I should say, so stop releasing it. So just giving you a sense, just because something is an adrenergic agonist, there is actually a special case where an adrenergic agonist actually inhibits sympathetic activity because of the role that these receptors play in telling this neuron there's already plenty of norepinephrine. Does that make sense? Okay. So more things. So far we've been talking about, the sympathetic and parasympathetic as kind of antagonistic. One's speeding up your heart, one's slowing down your heart, one's dilating bronchial, one's constricting bronchial passages, one's dilating your pupils, one's constricting your pupils. There are a few cases where they don't have that kind of easy kind of relationship where one does the opposite of the other. So some things, there's a couple of things that are purely sympathetic. One is sweating. So sweating more or less is just more or less activation of your sympathetic nervous system, right? You don't have parasympathetic to turn off the sweat. It's just more or less sweating is more or less sympathetic. This is actually also really useful, particularly in kind of in research, because if you take somebody's hand and you put some electrodes on there and you measure, what is the resistance? This is supposed to be somebody's hand. So sweat is basically salt water, right? What do we know about salt water and electricity?
It conducts it.
It conducts electricity, right? Salt conducts electricity. We talked about that. So the more you sweat, the lower the electrical resistance, the more electrical current can go across from one finger to the next through this little circuit that we have. So we call this GSR, galvanic skin response. Basically, the resistance across your skin is very proportional to your sympathetic activation. This is like part of these lie detector tests. You put these electrodes on their fingers, and if they're getting nervous, you can see the electrical resistance going down, or the electrical conductance, we say, going up. We actually, and this is kind of sad, you won't see it. We have one of these in the lab. People use them sometimes as part of their research projects. If you look at conductance, electrical conductance across the skin, it's got something, and then it's really kind of fun. You can either do physical or emotional. You can you kick somebody, they're like, whoa, what did you just, they're not used to the teacher coming out of the blue and kicking them. And you just kind of goes up, stays up for a while, and eventually kind of comes back down. But it's that sympathetic activation. There's they turn on, what the heck just happened? Or you can ask them a question. You can did you have sex last night? And they're like, what? And all of a sudden you just see it just go up. It's really hilarious. But so anything that kind of causes that kind of that sympathetic response, you can see typically as reflected in the electrical conductance of the skin going up, because part of that response is turning on sweat glands. Right. So part of a polygraph, polygraph means lots of things. They look at your heart rate. But this is one of the important things they look at is the skin conductance. Because it is one of the things that gives you a readout on sympathetic activity. Right. Like in those spy books, people, they'll put a tack in their shoe so they can just give themselves pain randomly, so the their sympathetic response is kind of random and isn't related to the questions that are being asked. Did you steal the secret papers? It's hard to tell because his skin conductance is going up and down crazy all the time. So anyway, so sympathetic things that are just sympathetic: sweating. Another thing that is just sympathetic, let me erase this, or maybe not just sympathetic, but mainly sympathetic. I'm going to say most smooth muscle in your blood vessels. When we talk about control of blood pressure, we're going to talk about vasomotor. Vaso, vessel, motor, the muscle. We have these blood vessels and we can squeeze them to change the diameter. But if you want a blood vessel to get larger in diameter, it basically just has to relax and it's going to get bigger because there's all the blood pressure inside. So for most, there's going to be exceptions. In fact, we'll talk about in just a few moments, the erection during sexual response is vasodilation. And so it's obviously relaxing of smooth muscle in the blood vessels, but that's going to be a parasympathetic reflex. But for the most part, when you think about the autonomic motor neurons that are adjusting the diameter of your blood vessels, they're going to be sympathetic. So for the most part, you think about blood vessels, the vasomotor system being under sympathetic control. What else? The last thing I will say, right, we usually think of sympathetic and parasympathetic and opposition to each other. So like I said, there's a couple of examples where they're not in opposition, like sweating and blood vessels are kind of primarily just sympathetic. We'll talk more about this at the very end of the semester, but a place where they work together is in sexual response, the erection and the vasodilation and all that is parasympathetic, but then kind of right at the, there has to be a switch, an orgasm, and ejaculation and all that is going to be sympathetic. So they're kind of working together towards a common end rather than fighting each other. But for the most part, they tend to be antagonistic. So any questions about the motor parts of the peripheral nervous system? Right, so somatic to the skeletal, autonomic with the more details. When we get to the muscles after break, we'll talk more detail about the muscle cells themselves, whether skeletal muscle or smooth muscle, and what happens when you release that acetylcholine or norepinephrine at the muscle and how that actually results in a physical pull, the actual contraction. So we'll go more into detail about what happens at the neuromuscular junction and how that leads ultimately to a contraction, but that's for after our break. What I'm going to do now is we're going to wrap up the nervous system by doing the sensory part of the peripheral nervous system.